retreat while being relentlessly pursued by a non-existent sound only one of them could hear. The search teams finally found the three hikers 3 days later, miles off the logged route and huddled together at the bottom of a shallow ravine. They had all succumbed to a combination of hypothermia and exhaustion. They had never been lost. They had simply been running in a panic from a sound that only one person could truly hear. The signal from the broken military relay station was briefly activated during the unexpected blizzard, causing the localized fray effect that ultimately drove the three experienced hikers to their tragic final route. You can't outrun the fog that followed them. The desolate stretch of coastal highway was infamous among locals for sudden, blinding, and dangerous weather shifts. Drivers frequently reported that the thick gray mist could appear from nowhere and swallow cars whole. The road wound dangerously along the steep cliffs that overlooked the churning and dark Pacific Ocean below. It was on this lonely road that a 34-year-old courier named Corbin Vance vanished. Corbin was a reliable driver who had worked the graveyard shift for a logistics company for years. He was transporting a secure shipment of computer server components worth nearly $80,000 that night. The date was October 14th in the year 2012, a calm and clear Tuesday night. The initial setup for his disappearance seemed entirely routine, according to the dispatch logs and GPS data. Corbin checked in with his dispatcher at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning from a gas station. He reported that the sky was clear and the moon was bright enough to see the water. He purchased a large black coffee and a pack of gum before getting back into his van. The security camera at the station showed him looking relaxed and humming along to the station radio. There was absolutely no indication that he was worried or that he felt he was being followed. He pulled out of the station and turned north onto the empty highway toward the distant city. The incident began approximately 40 minutes later when Corbin made a frantic call to the dispatch center. The operator reported that Corbin sounded breathless and terrified as he spoke about the weather changing instantly. He claimed that a wall of dense white fog had just rolled over his vehicle from behind. "It's not natural. It is moving faster than I can drive," he shouted over the radio static. The operator tried to calm him down and asked him to pull over if visibility was zero. Corbin yelled back that he could not stop because there was something inside the fog with him. The call cut out abruptly with the sound of screeching tires and a loud metallic crunching noise. The complication arose when the first responders arrived at the GPS location roughly 20 minutes later. The highway was completely clear of fog, and the night sky was filled with bright stars. They found Corbin's delivery van parked haphazardly on the soft shoulder of the road near the guardrail. The engine was still idling quietly, and the headlights were cutting through the clear darkness of the night. The driver's side door was wide open, and the interior cabin light was flickering on and off. Corbin Vance was nowhere to be found, and his cell phone was lying on the asphalt. Detective Silas Reed was assigned to the case the following morning after the strange initial report filed. Reed was a veteran investigator who had seen plenty of accidents on that dangerous stretch of road. He assumed initially that Corbin had hit a deer and perhaps fallen over the cliff in shock. He ordered a massive search and rescue operation to comb the rocky shoreline hundreds of feet below. The search teams spent 3 days scanning the cliffs and the water, but found absolutely nothing. There was no body, no torn clothing, and no sign that anyone had gone over the edge. The investigation shifted when Detective Reed began to look closer at the van and the cargo inside. The back doors of the van were still locked, and the expensive computer servers were completely untouched. This immediately ruled out a simple robbery or a hijacking gone wrong as a primary motive. Reed turned his attention to the vehicle's mechanical computer and the recorded data from the engine block. The data showed that Corbin had been driving at erratic speeds for 3 minutes before stopping abruptly. He had accelerated to nearly 90 miles per hour on a road rated for only 45. Detective Reed requested the raw audio files from the dispatch center to analyze the background noise deeper. He sat in a quiet room and listened to Corbin's terrified voice over and over again on loop. He noticed a strange, low-frequency humming sound that was audible just beneath the sound of the engine. It sounded mechanical and rhythmic, like a large industrial fan or a powerful ventilation system running hard. This sound did not match the profile of any standard vehicle engine or natural wind noise. Reed sent the audio file to a state forensic audio specialist for a more detailed spectral analysis. The specialist reported back 2 days later with a finding that changed the entire scope of the case. The background noise contained a specific frequency signature that matched a high-output military-grade smoke generator. This was not natural sea fog that Corbin had encountered on that lonely stretch of coastal highway. Someone had deliberately deployed a massive chemical smokescreen to blind the driver and force him to stop. Reed realized that the fog that chased Corbin was actually a weaponized cloud used for concealment. The question remained why they would do this if they did not steal the valuable cargo. Reed went back to the witness reports from that night to see if anyone saw another vehicle. A long-haul trucker named Arlene Pyle had passed through that sector around 2:15 that morning. She reported seeing a large, matte black, modified box truck parked on a fire access road nearby. She told the detective that the truck had strange pipes mounting on the rear bumper facing outward. Arlene thought it was a road maintenance vehicle, spraying for weeds or conducting some night repair work. The truck had no reflective markings, no license plate, and no company logo visible on the side. Detective Reed pulled the traffic camera footage from the toll booth 30 miles south of the incident. He scanned hours of video until he found a graining image of the black truck Arlene described. The truck passed the toll booth at 1:30 in the morning, trailing Corbin's van by distance. Reed zoomed in on the image and noticed the driver was wearing heavy tactical goggles and a mask. This was a sophisticated, organized crew that had targeted Corbin for a specific reason unknown to police. Reed theorized that the cargo was a decoy and Corbin himself was the actual target. The investigation deepened when Reed looked into Corbin's past employment before he became a delivery driver. He discovered that Corbin had worked briefly as a security consultant for a private armored car firm. He had been fired 3 years prior for raising concerns about a vulnerability in their routing software. The firm had dismissed his claims as paranoia and let him go with a small severance package. Reed contacted the firm and learned that they had suffered a massive theft just 2 days ago. The thieves had used a weather event to obscure cameras while they robbed a facility in Seattle. Reed connected the dots and realized the crew needed Corbin's biometric data to unlock the routing system. They didn't need the servers in his van. They needed his fingerprints and his retinal scan. The fog was used to capture him without any satellite or traffic cameras recording the abduction event. The black truck with the smoke generator allowed them to create their own cover anywhere they wanted. Reed issued a multi-state alert for the modified black box truck and the missing driver immediately. He described the suspects as highly dangerous and equipped with military-grade diversionary technology and tactical gear. The breakthrough came a week later when a state trooper spotted the black truck in a warehouse district. The truck was parked behind a derelict factory that had been closed since the year 2008. Reed and a SWAT team surrounded the building and moved in with extreme caution and precision. They found the truck inside the warehouse, still smelling faintly of the chemical fog agent used. In the back office of the warehouse, they found Corbin Vance bound to a chair but alive. He was dehydrated and terrified, but he had not given up the final encryption keys yet. The twist revealed itself when they processed the suspects arrested at the scene of the warehouse raid. The leader of the crew was the very same manager who had fired Corbin 3 years earlier. The manager had orchestrated the thefts and realized he needed Corbin's old access codes to finish the job. He knew Corbin's route and had built the fog truck specifically to trap him on the coast. The fog was a terrifying psychological weapon designed to make the abduction look like a tragic accident. The manager planned to throw the van off the cliff after they extracted the necessary data. The payoff was the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen property from the manager's previous heists. Corbin Vance was reunited with his family and eventually sued the security firm for millions in damages. The black truck with the smoke machine was impounded and studied by federal authorities for its ingenuity. The fog that followed Corbin was not a ghost or a weather phenomenon, but human greed. Detective Reed retired a year later, finally satisfied that he had solved the riddle of the mist. The coastal highway remained dangerous, but at least one unnatural predator had been removed from the road. The case of the man who was chased by the fog became a local legend instantly. It reminded everyone that sometimes the most impossible threats have the most grounded and human explanations. Corbin never drove that stretch of Highway 101 again for the rest of his life. He found a quiet desk job in a city far away from the ocean and the mist. But every time the weather turned gray, he likely remembered the white wall that chased him down. It was a silent warning that you can never truly outrun the past or the truth. No clue at the lake pier? Check the rope marks. The silent waters of Blackwood Lake held secrets that the local sheriff often missed during his hurried morning patrols. A boat adrift usually tells a simple story of bad weather or a run of terrible luck. But sometimes the weathered wood of a private dock holds the only true witness to a violent crime. This story follows the documented investigation into a disappearance that was almost written off as a tragic drowning. Harlan Vance arrived at the remote lakeside property on a Tuesday morning in late October of 2014. The air was crisp and smelled of decaying pine needles and the damp, heavy scent of the stagnant lake water. Harlan was a forensic marine surveyor who was hired by insurance companies to investigate suspicious claims on the water. He was 52 years old with a weathered face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His assignment was to investigate the disappearance of a wealthy software developer named Arthur Sterling from his private dock. The local police report stated that Arthur Sterling had taken his 30-foot cruiser out for a sunset ride. They believed he had accidentally fallen overboard and drowned in the deep, cold waters of Blackwood Lake. The boat was found drifting 3 miles offshore the next morning with the engine in neutral and the tank empty. There were no signs of a struggle on board and no blood evidence to suggest foul play occurred. The local sheriff had already classified the case as an accidental death and was preparing to close the file. Harlan walked down the long wooden staircase that led from the main house to the private boat dock below. The stairs were slick with morning dew and covered in a layer of wet, slippery autumn leaves. He moved slowly and carefully while holding the railing to avoid taking a nasty fall on the steep slope. His goal for the morning was to find any physical evidence that contradicted the official timeline of events. The insurance company was hesitant to pay out a $4 million life insurance policy without absolute proof of death. The dock itself was a sturdy structure built from heavy pressure-treated lumber and supported by thick cedar pilings driven into mud. The empty slip where Arthur kept his boat was silent except for the gentle lapping of the dark water. Harlan set his heavy equipment bag down on the wooden decking and took out a high-resolution digital camera. He began by photographing the entire scene from multiple angles to preserve the current state of the environment. He looked for footprints, dropped items, or any disturbance in the algae that grew on the wet wood. He spent the first hour examining the metal cleats where the boat's mooring lines would have been tied securely. The galvanized steel cleats showed the usual signs of wear and tear from years of exposure to the elements. There was some minor rust and the usual chafing where nylon ropes had rubbed against the metal over time. Nothing about the cleats appeared unusual or suggested that the boat had left the dock in a hurry. Harlan stood up and rubbed his chin while looking out across the gray, misty surface of the huge lake. He turned his attention to the vertical wooden pilings that guided the boat in and out of the narrow slip. These heavy posts were wrapped in black rubber bumpers to protect the fiberglass hull of the expensive vessel. Harlan ran his gloved hand along the rough wood of the piling on the starboard side of the slip. He noticed a small area where the black rubber bumper had been torn away from the wood. Beneath the torn rubber, he found a deep, fresh gouge in the cedar wood of the piling. The gouge was about 4 inches long and it went deep into the grain of the soft wood. It was not a scrape from a boat hull or a dent from a careless docking maneuver. It looked like a burn mark caused by a rope moving at incredible speed under extreme tension. Harlan leaned in closer and used a magnifying loupe to examine the fibers inside the deep, dark groove. He saw tiny, melted strands of blue synthetic material embedded deep within the splintered wood grain of the piling. He realized immediately that Arthur Sterling's boat used standard white nylon dock lines like almost every other boat on the lake. The blue fibers did not match any rope that was found on the drifting vessel the next day. Harlan took a pair of tweezers from his kit and carefully extracted a sample of the blue plastic fiber. He He placed the sample into a small plastic evidence bag and labeled it with the date and time. Sight, start. He knew that this type of friction burn could only be caused by a specific type of line. Sight, 1125. It was a braided high-modulus polyethylene line which was commonly used for heavy-duty towing or industrial winching operations. This type of rope was incredibly strong and had a very low melting point compared to standard nylon dock lines. The friction from the rope sliding around the wooden piling had generated enough heat to melt the outer fibers instantly. The angle of the cut was also highly suspicious as it wrapped around the back of the piling. This suggested the line had been used to pull the boat backward out of the slip against a strong force. Harlan sat on the edge of the dock and visualized the physics of the scene based on the new evidence. If Arthur had simply untied his boat and motored out, there would be no reason for such a mark. The mark implied that a second vessel had been positioned behind the dock or out in the deeper water. A line had been run from that second vessel around this piling and attached to Arthur's boat in the slip. The piling had acted as a pulley to winch the boat out of the slip without starting the engine. This contradicted the witness statement from a neighbor who claimed to hear Arthur's engine start up at dusk. Harlan suspected the neighbor had actually heard the engine of the second vessel that was towing the boat away. The killer had likely used the winch maneuver to move the boat quietly until it was far from the shore. Harlan packed his gear and decided to visit the only place on the lake that used that specific rope. He drove his rental car 10 miles around the shore to the commercial marina and service yard. The service yard was a chaotic collection of rusted boat trailers and piles of discarded marine salvage equipment. Harlan walked into the main office and asked to speak with the yard manager about purchasing some tow line. Sight, start. The manager was a gruff man named Silas, who pointed Harlan toward a large spool of blue synthetic rope in the corner. Sight, 25. It was an exact visual match for the melted fibers Harlan had found embedded in the wooden piling. Harlan asked Silas if anyone else on the lake purchased that specific type of expensive industrial-grade line. Silas laughed and said that the line was overkill for any recreational boater on Blackwood Lake. He explained that he only sold it to the local barge operator who maintained the lake's floating docks and buoys. The barge operator was a man named Dennis Cole who had a workshop located on the north side of the lake. Harlan thanked the manager and immediately headed toward the north side to find Dennis Cole and his barge. He knew that finding the rope on Cole's vessel would be the key to solving the entire mystery. Sight, start. He found the work barge moored at a small private landing that was hidden behind a thick stand of trees. Sight, 25. The barge was a flat, ugly vessel equipped with a large hydraulic winch mounted on the steel deck. Harlan approached the barge cautiously and saw that the winch was spooled with the distinctive blue braided line. He walked up to the winch and inspected the working end of the heavy blue rope. The last 10 feet of the line were frayed and showed signs of recent heavy abrasion and wear. Harlan took a quick photo of the winch and the rope before anyone could spot him on the private property. He then noticed something even more incriminating stuck to the greasy drum of the large hydraulic winch. It was a small scrap of black rubber that looked exactly like the material from the torn dock bumper. The friction had been so intense that it had ripped the bumper and fused a piece of it to the rope. Sight, start. The rope then transferred that piece of rubber back onto the winch drum when it was reeled in. He returned to his car and called the lead detective to report his findings at the dock and the barge site. 25. The physical evidence of the rope burn and the matching line placed the barge at the scene. The police obtained a warrant to search Dennis Cole's property and financial records later that same afternoon. They discovered that Cole had received a large cash payment from Arthur Sterling's business partner just 2 days prior. The business partner had paid Cole to dispose of the body and the boat to make it look like an accident. Sight. Start. Arthur had been killed in his home, and his body was placed on the boat under the cover of darkness. Sight, 26. Cole had used his barge and the winch to silently pull the boat out of the slip without starting the engine. Sight. Start. The blue winch line had rubbed against the piling with massive force as it dragged the heavy cruiser into open water. Sight, 26. They towed the boat to the middle of the lake and then set it adrift to confuse the timeline. Sight. Start. The engine noise the neighbor heard was actually the heavy diesel engine of the barge working the hydraulic winch sight. 26. Harlan Vance wrote his final report for the insurance company 2 weeks after the arrest of the two men. The claim for the accidental death was denied based on the undeniable proof of the staged crime scene. The entire case had turned on a single, melted groove in a piece of weathered cedar wood. The rope marks told a story of physics and friction that no lie could ever hope to cover up. Sight. Start. It was a reminder that even in the silence of the lake, the truth always leaves a mark. Sight. 27. This recovered voicemail was never meant for you. The digital file sat unnoticed on a corrupted hard drive for nearly 15 years before anyone clicked play. This story concerns the accidental discovery of a deleted voicemail that solved a decade-old cold case. It involves a single piece of audio evidence that implicated a trusted community figure in a grim conspiracy. In the winter of 2022, Silas Kane was working as a freelance data recovery specialist. He operated out of a small, windowless office located in the basement of a refurbished warehouse in the city. Silas was 41 years old and spent his days salvaging family photos from water-damaged laptops. His primary goal for that rainy Tuesday was to recover data from a batch of estate sale electronics. A local probate attorney had hired him to scan several old devices for any financial records or crypto keys. The attorney was handling the estate of a wealthy but reclusive property developer who had died without a will. The box of electronics smelled of mildew and stale tobacco smoke, suggesting it had been stored in a damp basement. Silas picked up a dusty silver flip phone that had been manufactured around 2006. The plastic casing was cracked near the hinge, and the charging port was packed with lint. The battery was swollen and useless, so he carefully wired the device directly to his bench power supply unit. He bypassed the damaged screen and mounted the internal storage directly to his main forensic workstation to read the raw hex code. Silas was a patient man who enjoyed the meditative process of sifting through lines of binary code. Most of the data was corrupted junk, but he found one audio file flagged with a strange system error. The file was a voicemail that had been received but never listened to by the phone's original owner. The timestamp indicated it was recorded at 3 in the morning on November 4th, 2008. Silas converted the raw data into a playable waveform and put on his heavy noise-canceling studio headphones. The audio was initially just a wall of static and digital artifacts caused by the memory chip degrading over time. He applied a basic noise reduction filter and boosted the gain to see if any human speech was hidden there. A woman's voice cut through the static, sounding breathless, terrified, and speaking in a hushed, desperate whisper. She said, "I am at the meeting spot, but the gate is locked. Please pick up the phone right now." The voice cracked with emotion, and Silas could hear the distinct sound of her shallow, panicked breathing against the microphone. This discovery immediately unsettled Silas because he recognized the date from a famous local missing persons case. A young investigative journalist named Clara Reed had vanished on that exact night in 2008 without a trace. Silas paused the playback and brought up the archived police reports and old news articles about the Reed disappearance. The police had always suspected she was meeting a confidential informant that night, but they never found her phone. The phone Silas was holding did not belong to Clara Reed. It belonged to a prominent city councilman named Gregory Haynes. The estate lawyer had not mentioned that the electronics belonged to the late councilman, only that they were from a high-profile client. Silas realized he was holding the device of the person Clara was trying to contact in her final moments. He decided to perform a deep spectral analysis on the background noise of the call to pinpoint her location. He spent the next 6 hours using advanced audio isolation software to separate the voice from the environment. He needed to prove that this voicemail was indeed from Clara and that she was in danger when she called. The first thing he isolated was a low, rhythmic thumping sound that repeated every 4 seconds in the background. It sounded like a heavy mechanical heartbeat echoing in a large, empty space. He ran the thumping sound through a sound effects library and identified it as a heavy industrial pile driver. This made sense because the city was undergoing a massive waterfront construction project during late 2008. However, construction crews did not operate pile drivers at 3 in the morning due to strict noise ordinances in the city. Silas adjusted the frequency equalization to focus on the very high end of the audio spectrum near 15 kilohertz. He heard the faint, distinct screech of metal wheels turning on a curved steel track in the distance. The sound was high-pitched and piercing, cutting through the low rumble of the thumping noise. He cross-referenced the construction schedules from the city archives with the transit authority logs from that year. The only active rail line near a construction site that night was the old freight spur near the docks. But the piledriver sound was still a mystery until he realized it wasn't a construction machine at all. It was the rhythmic thud of a heavy boat engine idling at a dock with a loose exhaust manifold. Silas filtered out the engine noise and the woman's voice to see if he could hear anything else in the room. He turned the volume up until his ears rang, searching for any sonic clue that could identify the specific location. He found a third sound layer that was barely audible beneath the heavy breathing of the terrified woman. It was a faint electronic beep followed by a synthesized voice saying "System armed" from a security panel. Silas recognized that specific voice prompt from an old model of commercial security systems used in warehouses. He enhanced the audio further and heard the distinct sound of a heavy metal latch clicking shut just feet away. The woman in the recording gasped, and the line went dead immediately after the latch sound was captured. The recording ended with a final, chilling silence that felt heavier than the static that preceded it. Silas began to piece together the terrifying narrative of what happened to Clara Reed on that cold November night. She had gone to meet Councilman Haynes at a warehouse near the docks, believing he had information for her story. She arrived at the agreed location, but the gate was locked, and she made a frantic call to his personal cell. The voicemail proved that Haynes was not asleep at home as he had claimed in his original witness statement. The background audio proved she was lured into a trap where a boat was waiting to take her away. The boat engine, he heard, was likely the vessel that would transport her body out to deep water. The killer had likely used the winch maneuver to move the boat quietly until it was far from the shore. Silas examined the metadata of the deleted voicemail file more closely in the hex editor. He discovered that the voicemail had not just been ignored, it had been manually marked as hidden by a user. This required a specific passcode to be entered into the phone's system settings to mask the file from the inbox. This proved that Gregory Haynes had seen the incoming call, ignored it, and then buried the evidence of the voicemail. Haynes had knowingly left Clara trapped at the location while he likely orchestrated the cleanup operation from a safe distance. Silas felt a cold sweat on his neck as he realized he was holding the smoking gun of a murder case. He exported the cleaned audio file and the detailed spectral analysis report to a secure, encrypted drive. He knew he could not simply walk into a police station with this evidence, given the councilman's influence. He contacted a retired federal agent named Marcus Vance, who had worked the original case and was known for his integrity. Marcus agreed to meet Silas at a neutral location to review the findings and verify the authenticity of the digital file. They met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city where they could talk without being overheard. The twist came when Marcus listened to the enhanced audio and identified the security system voice prompt immediately. He told Silas that the specific system-armed voice was only used in one private secure storage facility in the city. That facility was owned by a shell company that was quietly managed by the councilman's own brother, a maritime logistics contractor. The boat engine, Silas heard, was actually the facility's massive hydraulic ventilation fan that had a broken bearing for months. Clara Reed had not been at the docks. She had been lured inside the councilman's family storage unit and sealed inside. The background noise of the metal wheels was not a train, but the automated crane system inside the massive storage warehouse. The final clicking sound was the electronic lock of a long-term storage container engaging from the outside. The voicemail was not a plea for help from the street, it was a recording of her being sealed into a container. The "you" she was calling was the man who had just walked out of the room and locked the door behind him. She was calling the phone in his pocket while he stood on the other side of the steel wall. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. Haynes had been standing right there, listening to her ringtone. The payoff was grim, but provided the closure that the Reed family had been seeking for over a decade. The authorities obtained a federal warrant to search the specific storage container that had been rented under the shell company's name. They found the container was still sealed and listed as containing archived office furniture on the manifest. Inside, they found the remains of Clara Reed along with her notebook and her own cell phone. The evidence on her phone corroborated Silas's findings and detailed the corruption story she was about to break. She had hidden the notebook inside the upholstery of an old chair within the container before she died. Gregory Haynes was arrested the following week and charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder based on the new digital evidence. The recovered voicemail was played in open court, silencing the room with the terrified final words of the young journalist. The defense tried to argue the audio was fabricated, but Silas's detailed forensic report on the background frequencies held up under scrutiny. The jury convicted Haynes after only 4 hours of deliberation, ending his political career and his freedom. The audio file was the final nail in the coffin of a man who thought he had buried his secrets forever. Silas Kane returned the old flip phone to the evidence locker and went back to his quiet basement office. He wiped his server of the case files, but he kept a backup copy of the spectral analysis as a reminder. He learned that data never truly dies. It just waits for the right person to listen closely enough. The silence of that old digital file had spoken louder than any witness ever could. Why this boarded-up ranger cabin changed everything. The dense forest of the northern Cascade foothills had always been a place of deep silence and terrifying shadows. Locals in the small town of Pine Creek rarely ventured past the marked trails due to old, deeply ingrained superstitions. The area was notorious for steep ravines and sudden weather shifts that could disorient even the most experienced hikers immediately. This widespread reputation for danger was the primary reason a specific section of the woods remained completely unexplored for decades. A 52-year-old land surveyor named Wade Gentry was the first person to break that long and mysterious silence. Wade had been hired by the state to update the topographical maps for a potential future logging contract. He was a man who genuinely preferred the company of trees over people and worked with meticulous, methodical patience every day. The setup for the discovery began on a cloudy Tuesday morning in late October of 2014. Wade parked his truck at the end of an old fire road and hiked 3 full miles inland toward his objective. His goal for the day was simply to locate a series of old boundary markers originally placed in the 50s. The forest was thick with undergrowth, and the air smelled heavily of damp earth and decaying pine needles everywhere. He moved slowly through the terrain while checking his modern GPS unit against the faded paper maps he carried. It was around noon when he spotted something angular and distinctly unnatural sitting in a small clearing ahead of him. That sight felt incredibly wrong in the pristine natural environment. The incident occurred when Wade pushed through a thick wall of blackberry bushes and stumbled unexpectedly upon a structure. It was a small wooden cabin that had clearly been exposed to the harsh elements for many years without any maintenance. The wood was gray and rotting, and moss covered almost the entire roof in a thick, insulating green blanket. What made the cabin strange and highly suspicious was that every single window and door was heavily boarded up with solid timber. The boards were not just nailed on carelessly, but were bolted into the frame with heavy industrial hardware and tools. It looked less like a simple shelter and more like a sturdy wooden cage designed specifically to keep something inside. The complication arose when Wade realized this structure did not appear on any of his official state maps that he possessed. He circled the perimeter of the cabin and noticed that the heavy bolts on the door were rusted but still completely intact and secured. Curiosity suddenly got the better of him, and he used a long pry bar from his pack to leverage the wood away slowly and carefully. It took him nearly 20 minutes of hard, sustained work to remove enough boards to access the front door. The door itself was unlocked, which felt incredibly unsettling given the extreme measures taken to seal the exterior completely. He pushed the door open and was immediately hit by a stale, dry smell of old dust and decay. Wade stepped inside the cabin and clicked on his heavy flashlight to illuminate the dark and windowless interior space fully. The cabin was simply furnished like a standard ranger outpost from the late 80s or early 90s era. There was a simple cot, a small wood stove, and a small table with a kerosene lantern sitting on top of it. However, the walls were covered in strange hand-drawn maps that were taped up with multiple layers of yellowing Scotch tape. Wade moved closer to the table and saw a leather-bound logbook sitting right next to the lantern. He opened the book and saw the name Ranger Silas Vance, written neatly on the inside cover of the book. The investigation officially began 2 full days later when Wade returned to the site with Sheriff Deputy Lana Harks. Lana was a 40-year-old investigator who had grown up in the general area and knew the local history extremely well. She recognized the name Silas Vance immediately as a park ranger who had suddenly vanished in 1996. The official story that had been accepted was that Silas had quit his job abruptly and relocated to Alaska to live alone. His disappearance had been treated as a voluntary resignation, and no one had ever seriously looked for him since that time. Finding his cabin boarded up in a restricted zone completely shattered that old, widely accepted narrative for the department. Detective Harks immediately declared the cabin a major crime scene and called in a full forensic team to process the interior thoroughly. They carefully removed the maps from the walls and cataloged every single item found within the small room. The team found a loose floorboard under the cot that hid a small metal ammunition box underneath it. Inside the box were 12 different driver's licenses belonging to different people from all over the United States. Lana ran the names through the National Crime Information Center database back at the station that very evening. Every single person in that box had been reported missing between 1990 and 1996. The cold logic of the case began to form a deeply terrifying picture of what Silas Vance had actually been doing for years. He had not been protecting the forest, but had been using his authority to hunt vulnerable, unsuspecting drifters. The location of the cabin was perfect because it was miles away from all the popular, crowded tourist trails. He would reportedly offer help to lost hikers and lure them to this isolated off-grid location for false safety. The help he offered was a terrible lie, and the cabin was the final destination for these missing people. The maps on the wall were marked with red X symbols that corresponded exactly to where bodies were likely buried. The investigation deepened significantly when the forensic pathologist examined the cabin for biological evidence using advanced luminol testing procedures. The wooden floorboards lit up with brilliant traces of blood that had soaked deep into the wood grain years ago. However, the most confusing piece of evidence was the way the cabin had been sealed so thoroughly from the outside. If Silas was the killer, it made no logical sense for him to board up his own house before he vanished somewhere. Detective Harks focused all her attention on the heavy industrial bolts that Wade had removed from the doorframe. They were a specific type of lag bolt used primarily in bridge construction and heavy logging operations in the area. Lana spent weeks digging into the employment records of every single logging company that operated in the area at that time. She found a work order from 1996 for a large bridge repair crew working near that ridge. The foreman of that crew was a dedicated man named Arthur Penn who had passed away in 2010. However, Arthur's son, a mechanic named David Penn, still lived in a quiet trailer just outside of town. Lana brought David in for questioning at the station and laid the photos of the boarded-up cabin on the table before him. David instantly went pale and reportedly asked for a lawyer before eventually agreeing to speak off the official record. The staggering twist revealed itself when David admitted that his father Arthur had discovered the cabin completely by accident. Arthur had gone looking for extra timber to cut and had stumbled upon Silas Vance in the middle of committing a horrible crime. Arthur saw Silas actively attacking a woman near the cabin and intervened immediately with his heavy logging tools. Arthur reportedly knocked Silas unconscious and forcibly dragged him inside the cabin to figure out exactly what to do next. He found the disturbing box of licenses and realized that Silas was an absolute monster who would likely escape justice entirely. Arthur made a terrible split-second decision to become the judge and also the executioner for the evil ranger. The final payoff was the shocking realization that the cabin was not a secret hideout for Silas, but his own terrible tomb. Arthur Penn had used the heavy lag bolts from his work truck to seal Silas inside while he was still unconscious on the cabin floor. He boarded up every single window and the only door with professional precision to ensure no escape was remotely possible at all. He left Silas to wake up in the dark and slowly starve to death in his own hidden, self-made prison. The disappearance of Silas Vance to Alaska was a complete rumor started by Arthur to meticulously cover his own tracks completely. The reason the cabin changed everything was because it dramatically changed the local hero narrative into a terrible vigilante killer story. Authorities immediately returned to the cabin and dismantled the floorboards to dig into the earth beneath the structure deeply. They found the skeletal remains of Silas Vance exactly where the evidence suggested they would be found. They also used the Rangers' old maps to locate the remains of 7 of the 12 missing people identified previously. The families of the victims finally received long-awaited answers after nearly 2 decades of agonizing silence and devastating uncertainty. The case was formally closed, but the town of Pine Creek was forever changed by the dark and secret truth. The quiet button on the story was the eventual demolition of the cabin by the State Forestry Service. They burned the wood completely on site and let the forest reclaim the small clearing once and for all. Wade Gentry continued his vital work as a surveyor, but he never went back to that specific ridge again. The deep forest was still beautiful, but everyone now knew that it could hide terrible secrets for a very long time. The silent warning of the boarded cabin was that justice sometimes looks very different than the written law. Hey there! Before you drift off, welcome to your adult bedtime story. Behind what looks like an ordinary event lies a truth that was never meant to be heard. And tonight, I'm going to tell it to you. Wherever you're watching from and whatever time it is, thanks for being here. If you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories, don't forget to subscribe. I will now generate the final long-form American English story, the hidden truth inside that shuttered bus depot. The sprawling East Side bus depot was a ghost in the heart of a vibrant urban renewal zone. The massive structure had stood dark and silent since the City Transit Authority decommissioned it in 2011. The building was slated for demolition and redevelopment into luxury condominiums by a major holding group. Most people saw only a massive, decaying concrete shell that represented an expensive problem for the city council. But for a few old-timers, the shuttered depot was the final resting place of a painful, half-forgotten secret. This specific story is the brutal legacy of a bitter labor fight from 3 decades ago. In the summer of 2024, a structural engineer named Elias Vance was tasked with the final pre-demolition survey. Elias was 49 years old and known for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to historical detail in all his work. His primary goal for the week was to map every column and floor plate of the 3-acre structure for the wrecking crew. He needed to accurately verify the original 1950s construction plans against the building's current physical state. The humid air inside the cavernous main garage smelled strongly of stale dust, old oil, and the sharp scent of nesting pigeons that had long been abandoned. Elias spent the entire first day walking the perimeter, noting the cracked skylights and the massive roll-up doors now sealed with rusted chains. He noted how the natural light struggled to penetrate the heavy grime on the windows, leaving the back half of the vast garage in deep, permanent shadows. The entire place was a monument to mid-century industrial architecture with its massive steel trusses and thick concrete block walls. As he moved into the lower maintenance bay, Elias noticed a discrepancy that immediately caught his practiced eye. The original plans showed a central drainage trench running the full length of the mechanics' pit area. However, the pit he was surveying was entirely paved over with a section of newer, dark gray concrete that felt distinctly out of place. The new concrete looked visually solid, but the color and the texture were subtly and clearly different from the surrounding original floor. It was a subtle but obvious sign of a hurried addition, or a sudden, unauthorized closure. Elias immediately checked the depot's archived maintenance logs and found a work order from 1988 detailing a routine floor repair. The description of the work was suspiciously brief. simply stating a utility trench was permanently secured and capped for safety reasons. The log did not specify what utility was sealed or what safety reason justified burying a 50-foot-long drainage system. The total area of the capped trench was approximately 400 square feet, a massive section of floor to abandon without proper documentation. The engineer felt something was severely out of sync and seemed to defy standard construction logic and common sense. Elias called his field team to bring down a ground-penetrating radar unit to quickly scan the strange anomaly in the floor. The technician ran the radar over the paved area, and the resulting screen image showed a clear, distinct subsurface void beneath the newer concrete layer. The void was about 5 feet deep and ran exactly where the old maintenance trench should have been located on the official blueprints. The radar also detected a series of small, dense metal objects irregularly spaced across the floor of the buried trench. The engineer realized that the city had not merely sealed a simple drainage trench. They had actually entombed an entire section of the facility containing something that had been hidden. Intriguing and unsettled by the clear evidence, Elias decided to physically enter the buried space to confirm his fears. He instructed his team to drill a 4-inch core sample through the newer concrete floor and directly into the void below the surface. As the drill broke through the material, a gust of cool, heavy air immediately rushed out, carrying a faint, musty scent that was difficult to identify. The air was not stale or dusty like the rest of the silent depot. It smelled like earth and old fabric that had been undisturbed for many decades. Elias inserted a flexible fiber optic camera through the newly bored hole to investigate the darkness and the silence below the surface. The camera's flashlight revealed a dry, concrete-walled chamber about 5 feet below the current floor level of the depot. The old drainage trench was indeed a massive, buried subfloor that was accessible only from the mechanic's pit. The dense metal objects detected by the radar were revealed to be small, rusted metal lockers, the kind mechanics typically used for personal items. There were 6 lockers positioned side by side against the far wall of the trench that had been permanently sealed. They were covered in thick cobwebs and a layer of dry silt, suggesting they had been down there since the trench was sealed and hidden. Elias returned to the surface and used his secure access to search the depot's old personnel files from the 1980s. He cross-referenced the names of the mechanics who worked on the night shift that year with the date the trench was sealed forever. He found 6 mechanics were listed as being transferred out of the depot immediately after the 1988 floor repair. One of the names, a young mechanic named Leo Cruz, was flagged in the records as having been subject to an internal disciplinary action a few months prior to the sealing. Leo Cruz was reportedly suspected of organizing a persistent protest against the deplorable working conditions in the poorly ventilated maintenance pit. Elias contacted a retired transit authority historian named Miriam Shah, who had written a comprehensive book on the city's labor history. Miriam reluctantly agreed to meet Elias at the depot gate the following morning, before the scheduled demolition crews arrived at the site. Elias showed her the recent radar scans and explained his startling findings about the sealed trench and the 6 missing lockers. Miriam's face went instantly pale, and she spoke in a low, somber voice as she confirmed the engineer's darkest and most painful suspicion. She told Elias that the depot was a hotbed of intense union activity in the 1980s, and the night shift mechanics were constantly fighting the entrenched management. The city council was desperate to crush the burgeoning union movement among the maintenance staff at any cost. Miriam explained that the night shift mechanics often held clandestine union meetings down inside the old abandoned drainage trench to avoid the pervasive surveillance cameras. The trench was the only place in the entire massive building that had any privacy and acoustic isolation for their secret meetings. Miriam revealed that Leo Cruz, the young union organizer, and his 5 closest allies vanished abruptly in 1988, just days before a major contract negotiation deadline. The official story at the time was that they had simply quit their jobs and left the state without giving any notice to anyone. However, none of the families or friends ever heard from any of the 6 men again after they vanished without a trace. They completely disappeared from all city civil records and the local tax rolls after the disappearance. Miriam believed that the city council had quickly authorized the permanent sealing of the trench after learning that a union meeting was in progress. The locker numbers detected by the radar matched the roster of the 6 vanished mechanics on the night shift. They had not been transferred out of the depot. They had been deliberately buried alive inside the trench with their personal lockers still intact. The emergency floor repair in the maintenance log was a thinly veiled cover story for a cold-blooded anti-union purge. The 6 mechanics had become inconvenient to the city, and their final meeting place became their permanent, unmarked tomb. Elias stood in the vast, silent garage and looked down at the circular mark where the core sample had been taken from the floor. He realized his final structural survey was not about measuring stress loads or checking column support for the wrecking crews. It was about confronting a brutal, buried chapter of the city's labor history that the power brokers had tried desperately to erase. The hidden truth inside the shuttered bus depot was the tragic final meeting of 6 men who died fighting for the fundamental rights of their fellow workers. Elias contacted the district attorney's office immediately to report the presence of a probable hidden burial site. The planned demolition of the East Side bus depot was immediately halted pending a full forensic excavation of the site. What happened in that empty church attic will shock investigators. The massive old stone church stood vacant at the corner of Cedar and 4th since the congregation moved out in 2018. The building was scheduled for historic preservation, which meant every inch of it had to be meticulously cataloged before restoration could begin. Most of the original structure dated back to the late 1920s, but the huge attic space had remained untouched for almost a century. It was a dark, high-vaulted chamber full of thick cobwebs and the smell of dry, decaying wood that had aged for decades. The silence in the attic was heavy and profound, unbroken by the usual sounds of the city below. In the late spring of 2025, a historical preservation architect named Ana Reyes began her final inspection of the property. Anna was 31 years old and specialized in documenting the complex structures of large, antiquated buildings like this church. Her simple goal for the day was to take detailed photographs of the attic's massive timber roof trusses and ventilation system for the historical archive. She wanted to ensure the structural integrity of the entire roof was sound before the expensive and complex restoration work was allowed to commence. Anna secured her heavy fiberglass ladder and ascended slowly through the small, square access hatch into the church attic above. The single bare bulb she had strung up did little to penetrate the vast darkness of the enormous space above the nave. The attic air was oppressive, dead, and unusually warm, even for an early afternoon in May in the city. As she moved slowly around the temporary wooden walkway that ran the length of the central beam, she saw what appeared to be an enormous, perfectly formed nest. It was nestled high in the eaves, near a large, arched, stained glass window overlooking the busy Main Street. The nest was far too large and perfectly structured to have been built by any normal bird or even a massive colony of bats. It was a perfectly spherical construction woven tightly from hundreds of feet of tightly braided steel antenna wire. The heavy, dark mass was supported by thick lengths of old, insulated coaxial cable secured around the massive wooden truss beam. Anna used her zoom lens to capture a photograph and then moved closer to examine the strange structure's perfect and unsettling symmetry. The woven sphere was approximately 6 feet in diameter and was completely silent in the stifling heat of the late spring afternoon. As Anna adjusted her footing near the unusual sphere, her work boot accidentally kicked a small, loose object lying completely hidden in the thick dust. She bent down and picked up a rusted, antiquated piece of radio equipment that was clearly very old and obsolete. It was a microphone assembly from a 1940s broadcast radio set with a tarnished brass grill that had oxidized over time. The microphone's long, silk-wrapped cable led directly to the base of the massive woven sphere of steel wire. The microphone's cable vanished into the bottom of the wire mass, suggesting it was still actively connected to the interior of the sphere. Anna realized immediately that this was not a nest at all, but a gigantic, elaborate hand-woven antennae array that was still completely intact. This entire complex structure had been deliberately built and carefully concealed up here almost 100 years ago, inside the church attic. She carefully took out her small toolkit and began to trace the thick coaxial cables that supported and fed the strange construction. The cables ran down the side of the wooden truss beam and disappeared into a narrow, dark utility shaft near the corner of the silent attic space. The architect immediately called her site manager and reported the discovery of a non-standard structure and a possible hidden electrical or safety hazard. The site manager contacted the city fire department, who then quickly dispatched a specialized hazardous materials team to the unusual location. The hazmat team arrived quickly and used a specialized camera to trace the underground path of the hidden cables. The camera followed the cables all the way down the utility shaft to a small, sealed utility closet in the church basement. The basement closet was found to be packed tightly with racks of heavily insulated, archaic 1940s-era communications gear and equipment. The entire system had been running off a series of massive, obsolete marine batteries that were being trickle-charged by a buried power line from an external source. The investigation deepened dramatically when the hazmat team found the equipment had been actively recording audio for decades without interruption. A heavy-duty, reel-to-reel tape recorder was running at a slow speed and was spooled with hundreds of feet of continuous magnetic tape. The heavy machine was housed in a custom-built, heavily shielded wooden box to prevent any electrical interference with the old church organs and the main power grid. The engineers quickly disconnected the hidden power supply and carefully secured the massive spool of recorded tape evidence. The forensic audio lab was immediately contacted to begin the meticulous and difficult process of digitizing and analyzing the historical recording. The lead audio forensics expert was a patient man named Dr. Howard Bell, who spent 3 days cleaning the noise from the magnetic tape. He finally realized that the 6-foot-wide woven sphere in the attic was a highly sensitive and directional microphone array. It had been strategically positioned to point directly at the original ornate stone pulpit on the main altar below the attic floor. The tape contained thousands of hours of every sermon, wedding, and funeral that had occurred in the church for decades without anyone knowing. It was an astonishing, continuous record of the church's public life for nearly 60 years of its continuous operation. But the tape also contained something the church leadership had desperately tried to conceal from the public and the historical records. Dr. Bell discovered a single 2-hour-long recording from the late 1970s that was highly unusual and disturbing. The recording was not a sermon or a service, but a private, heated conversation that took place late one night after the congregation had completely gone home. The deep, tense voices belonged to the late head priest, Father Thomas, and a wealthy city councilman who was highly influential. The two men were arguing intensely about a large sum of cash money and a recent real estate transaction involving the church's extensive charity holdings. The strained conversation quickly revealed that Father Thomas had been systematically laundering cash for the councilman for years through the church's various legitimate charity programs. The entire elaborate scam was designed to conceal millions of dollars in illegal payoffs from the city's massive municipal construction contracts. The priest had been using the church's tax-exempt status to cleverly conceal the illegal cash flow from the Internal Revenue Service investigators. The only person who knew about the existence of the entire system was the church's maintenance man, who was an avid, highly skilled radio enthusiast. He had secretly installed the elaborate recording equipment to document the conspiracy that was taking place just below the attic floor. The final, shocking twist was that the maintenance man, tired of the constant corruption, had bravely confronted the priest and the councilman. The confrontation took place in the attic, right next to the massive, listening woven sphere antenna in the stifling heat. The last 5 minutes of the reel-to-reel tape contained a terrifying, abrupt struggle, followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the wooden attic floor. The next sound captured was the distinct scraping of a shovel against the wood as Father Thomas and the councilman quickly moved the body away. The church's long-abandoned bell tower was quickly demolished and permanently sealed the next day due to supposed structural issues that were reported to the city. The original maintenance man was officially reported missing and was never seen again after that terrible night in 1978. The attic recording was his final piece of evidence and his only enduring hope for long overdue justice. The entire archaic communications system in the attic and basement was his silent, enduring witness to the crime. The truth in that empty church attic was not a historical relic or a structural curiosity for Ana Reyes to archive. It was the complete audio documentation of a massive corruption conspiracy that led to a brutal murder right next to the massive sound-collecting antenna. Ana Reyes' simple structural survey had uncovered a shocking, decades-old murder and a massive hidden corruption scandal that rocked the city council. The police immediately secured the old church and began a complete forensic excavation of the entire sealed bell tower base. The tape had finally spoken from the dark and silent attic after all those years. What happened inside this sealed hospital wing will shock you. The locked third floor of the West Wing held a forgotten secret for many decades. This true story follows the documented events leading up to the unexpected sealing of the area. It involves a single patient and the baffling circumstances surrounding their sudden, dramatic exit from the records. In the summer of 1987, Arthur Pendleton was a meticulous hospital archivist. He worked at the stately St. Jude's General Hospital in a quiet corner of the city. Arthur was 55 years old and a career employee devoted to organizing decades of brittle medical records. His main goal that day was simple but tedious, as he needed to track down the historical blueprints for the old West Wing structure. Management planned a huge renovation and demanded to see the original floor plans from the 1940s construction. They fully expected the information to be located deep in the dusty sub-basement of the main administration building. Arthur had been in the basement archives for hours when he found a peculiar, bound ledger hidden behind a loose shelf panel. It was a patient transfer log from the late 1953 era that seemed out of place. This ledger was not logged in the central index and appeared to be deliberately hidden within a stack of junk filing material. The ledger detailed a single, highly unusual transfer from the new East Wing to the West Wing's third floor. This was odd, since the third floor had been completely decommissioned and sealed just a few months prior to that date. The record showed the patient was a 32-year-old man named James Calder. Arthur kept the ledger and made a clean copy of the entry for James Calder as a precautionary measure. The paper trail ended abruptly with that cryptic entry and offered no other information about the man. He found no corresponding discharge papers or a death certificate recorded in the main hospital database for patient Calder. James Calder had apparently vanished without a trace after being moved into the sealed and empty wing with no other witnesses. The original construction blueprints finally surfaced later that afternoon, but Arthur could not shake his troubling discovery. He started comparing the faded blueprints to the sealed-off third floor's electrical diagrams in his small office. He noticed a minor discrepancy involving a single, heavy-duty electrical service box on the third floor. The box was located along the west corridor where patient Calder was reportedly taken. This electrical service box had not been properly disconnected when the rest of the floor was shut down and isolated. Arthur's job usually involved ink and paper, but now he was looking at a dark, confusing puzzle that made him feel very uneasy. A hospital maintenance engineer named Marcus Vaughn confirmed the sealed wing was never supposed to have any active power at all. Marcus was an overworked but reliable man in his mid-30s who had a reputation for honesty and thorough work. Marcus reluctantly agreed to help Arthur conduct a very quiet and unsanctioned investigation late that night after his scheduled shift ended. The two men accessed the third floor through a utility elevator that still reached the landing but was normally locked down with a chain. The elevator doors opened onto a dim, low-ceiling lobby, smelling faintly of rust and old cigarette smoke. The thick, steel fire door to the west wing was not locked with a key. It was sealed instead with a heavy lead bar and a dated brass padlock attached to the doorframe. They quickly realized that the original door was intended to be permanently sealed using the new bar and lock as a final, urgent measure. Archived calls later showed the lock had only been installed days after James Calder's recorded transfer. Marcus used a portable cutting torch to quickly sever the heavy lead bar in the empty hall. He managed the cut and seal in less than a minute, leaving a scorch mark. Inside, the wing was instantly silent and felt much colder, reeking heavily of dust and a strange metallic chemical odor. Everything looked exactly as it had in the 1950s, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed grime and filth. They could clearly see an old water cooler and some chairs still sitting in the main hall waiting for people who would never arrive. The first thing they checked was the inexplicable active electrical box in the corridor near room 320. Arthur used his digital camera to document the area, snapping photos of the aged and decaying hospital hallway and the mysterious electrical service box. Marcus found that the service box was indeed live and feeding power to an unknown separate circuit somewhere further down the hall. Following the heavy gauge wire from the service box led them to a supply closet near the patient rooms. They found the door had been heavily modified with newer steel plating and a complicated mechanical deadbolt. The walls around the door had fresh, unaged mortar, suggesting a very recent construction project compared to the rest of the old hospital wing. They knew someone had recently been there. Marcus quickly picked the complex lock, and they cautiously entered the small supply closet. Inside was not a closet, but a small secondary security anteroom. The walls were lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels, and one solid steel door led to an inner back room. They found a few discarded items in this outer space on a makeshift table made from stacked boxes. There was an old, heavy-duty reel-to-reel tape recorder and several spools of magnetic tape, all clearly labeled with the single patient name, J. Calder. Marcus placed one of the tapes onto the reel recorder and quickly pressed the play button. The tape contained an unnerving and repetitive sound of constant, extremely high-frequency electronic ringing. It sounded like an old television, with no signal or a dying telephone. A low, desperate voice occasionally cut through the piercing ringing noise. The voice was clearly Patient Calder, repeating the phrase, "I see colors," over and over again in a strained, fearful whisper. Then a different, calm voice would respond with something like, "The treatment is working, James." The calm voice sounded exactly like Dr. Elias Finch, a hospital researcher who died in a strange house fire years later in another state. Arthur felt a deep chill travel down his spine at the sound of the high-frequency noise. They quickly opened the final steel door and walked into the small room where the strange, unnerving sound was being generated. It was a heavily shielded patient room that was completely bare except for a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. The chair was wired with strange, homemade electrical components and heavy leather restraints that were well worn. On the wall, across from the chair, was a crude, hastily painted mural of swirling, bright, and impossible colors. Witness statements later reported that James Calder was terrified of bright colors after his military service due to a severe flash burn incident. This was his greatest fear on display. Arthur found a small, handwritten note stuck to the back of the bolted patient chair with old adhesive tape. The note was from Dr. Finch to an unnamed colleague dated December of 1953. It briefly explained that patient Calder was being kept alive with continuous low-voltage electrical impulses from the specialized circuit. The sole goal was to train the patient to see the bright colors without experiencing extreme terror. The treatment was considered a promising and groundbreaking form of aversion therapy in the 1950s using electric shock. It was a terrifying form of old medicine. But the treatment had clearly failed years ago and had been completely abandoned by the main hospital staff. Patient Calder's panic response had somehow physically manifested into the constant high-pitched ringing on the tapes. That ringing was a constant auditory expression of his ongoing, profound terror and suffering. James Calder was never discharged or transferred from St. Jude's General Hospital. He was simply sealed into that room where his useless treatment continued running on the isolated electrical circuit for 34 years. The shock came from the second-to-last line of Dr. Finch's note to his research associate. It stated that the small patient room was actually the original air conditioning condenser closet for the West Wing. He had simply painted the brightly colored mural over the main air return vent in the wall. The hospital never had to worry about him escaping. His panicked, terrifying ringing noise was not a recording, but a constant, living sound. It was quietly being vented throughout the entire West Wing's ductwork for over 3 decades of silence. It had been the sealed wing's secret all along. Arthur and Marcus cut the electrical service box with a quick flick of the main switch, and the horrible ringing immediately stopped. They left the hospital that morning with no proof other than the copied ledger and the brief, unsettling witness statements they had documented. The original notes from Dr. Finch were lost when the two men abandoned the room in a panic, but the hospital finally demolished the sealed West Wing several years later as originally planned. The bizarre, terrifying case of James Calder became a quiet cautionary tale among the city's seasoned electricians and HVAC contractors who were asked to complete the demolition job. 3 lost hikers' final route was logged on a broken GPS. The search for the 3 lost hikers concluded tragically in the autumn of 2023 when their damaged GPS unit was finally recovered. It contained an incomplete route log that showed their desperate final movements over a 72-hour period. The trail of evidence only deepened the puzzle of how 3 experienced climbers vanished just miles from a well-maintained logging road. The missing group consisted of 2 brothers and their climbing guide. The brothers were 40-year-old finance manager David Chen and his 37-year-old younger brother Michael. They had hired 32-year-old guide Rebecca Hale, a local expert with over a decade of experience in the remote Sierra Blanca wilderness. Their original plan was a simple 5-day ascent of the remote west ridge of Mount Corwin, a known but challenging peak. They logged their intended route with the park rangers and were due to check in on a Sunday afternoon. The search was launched on Monday morning when the group failed to make contact and a sudden early blizzard rolled into the mountains. Search and rescue teams immediately began combing the planned route, but found no sign of the hikers. After a week of intense searching yielded nothing, the weather finally cleared and a park ranger spotted a flash of bright color off the planned trail. It was Rebecca Hale's orange backpack snagged high on a rock outcropping. The backpack was mostly empty except for a large rock hammer, a frayed length of climbing rope, and a single cracked Garmin GPS unit. The GPS unit's screen was completely shattered, and the external casing was heavily damaged by blunt force trauma. The internal battery had also died, but the flash memory chip was miraculously intact. The lead investigator, Captain Elias Thorne of the Sheriff's Department, immediately sent the unit to the forensics lab for data extraction. The technicians managed to recover a partial route log showing the group's movements up until the unit was damaged and stopped recording. The recovered log confirmed the group had been following their pre-planned ascent route for the first 2 days of the hike. The final 72 hours of data, however, showed a dramatic and inexplicable deviation. Instead of continuing the climb toward the summit, the group abruptly turned and began moving rapidly downhill away from the mountain. The route log showed a frantic, meandering path through a thick, trackless forest and into a confusing labyrinth of narrow canyons. The timestamps showed they had been moving almost continuously, covering ground at a grueling pace, barely stopping to rest, even at night. Their speed indicated they were not lost. They appeared to be actively fleeing something. The final recorded point placed them less than 5 miles from the main, well-traveled logging road, which made their continued disappearance even more baffling. They should have reached the road and found help long before the blizzard hit the area. Captain Thorne immediately organized a new search based on the GPS unit's final logged coordinates. The search team reached the last recorded location and found the terrain exactly as the GPS indicated. It was a steep, heavily wooded ravine leading to a wide, open clearing. In the center of the clearing, the team found a hastily constructed, crude shelter made of broken branches and rocks. It was clearly abandoned and contained no sign of the 3 hikers. Inside the shelter, the team found a small, waterproof journal belonging to David Chen, the older brother. The last entry was dated 2 days after the GPS stopped recording and was scribbled frantically in the margins of a blank page. The final sentences were almost illegible, but suggested a profound sense of terror. David wrote about an unusual repeating sound and the constant presence of something that followed them but was never directly seen. He mentioned that Michael, his younger brother, had been hearing the sound for over a day before the other 2 noticed it. The journal confirmed the group had been hiding in the woods near the shelter. David also referenced a disagreement with Rebecca, the guide, over how to escape the unseen threat. Rebecca had insisted on staying put, arguing the unseen thing could not follow them into the dense forest, but the brothers insisted on fleeing downhill toward the logging road. The journal ended with a final desperate line about following Michael, who had reportedly run out into the open clearing. Captain Thorne went back to the forensic lab report on the cracked GPS unit. The technicians had also retrieved the corrupted internal memory file, which contained the system error log. The log showed the GPS unit's antenna had been jammed by a massive localized radio frequency interference a few hours before the unit was struck and shattered. The report noted the frequency was a highly unusual band, not typically used for civilian communications. Thorne realized the sound David Chen wrote about in his journal was almost certainly the high-pitched whine of the radio frequency interference that jammed the GPS. But the signal was highly localized and should have only affected the GPS unit. Michael, however, was hearing the sound before the GPS failed. Thorne immediately started researching the